Each of Beethoven's sonatas has a character of its own, and the variety from one sonata to the next is astonishing. The composer has his dramatic side, as in the finale of the Moonlight Sonata, his impassioned side, as in the Sonata Appassionata, his heroic side, as in the fast movement of the Waldstein Sonata, his deeply introspective side, as in the slow movement of the Sonata Pathétique, and so on. The present sonata, his Sonata in E-flat, Opus 31, number 3, I would call one of his most ingratiating, genial, airy, and fresh sonatas. In it, Beethoven seems to return once more to Mozart, as in this charming theme from the first movement. Or to Haydn in this robust passage from the last movement. But now we have a much subtler and very different Beethoven from the pure classicist that he was in his earliest piano sonatas. The problem is how to achieve this genial, airy style. There is no such thing as an easy Beethoven sonata. In this one, it is all too usual to fall into a heavy, labored performance. How can the numerous thorny difficulties be made to sound as though they don't exist, and the whole work be made to move along fluently? Let's divide and conquer, movement by movement and problem by problem. Starting with the opening movement, as always, the tempo must be decided first, because it can influence the very character of the music and much else in the playing. It is hard to find one prevailing tempo that suits all the ideas and passages in this movement equally well. Yet I do believe one must be found, and cannot accept the changes that von Bülow recommended in his well-known edition of the 19th century. You can get the tempo best from the second theme that I have started before. Think of the Alberti bass in this theme as light, fast, and distinct, but do not take it beyond the speed at which you can play 7 clear notes in each trill in the passage beginning at measure 67. This tempo may make the opening idea seem rather fast. 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3. But this is one of those short motives like that in the opening of Beethoven's Fifth Symphony that is very hard to do intelligently anyway. The 3 notes of the motive should move progressively from strong to weak, and without underplaying the 16th note because it is short. This note does have to be short and to belong to the following rather than the preceding note. Don't start the opening idea with a ritardando, and don't overdo the ritardando when you do get to it in measure 3 and similar places. Think of it as meaning slower later on, much as you will want to think of each crescendo as meaning louder later on. Beginning in measure 8, keep the triplets firm. Do not rush them. At the melisma that begins in measure 53 and later in measure 177, do not bump suddenly into the irregular grouping on the 3rd beat, but ease into and out of it. As is often done, a scarcely perceptible increase in tempo may be applied at the final a tempo in the coda. Among aids to technique, what I call a locked arm, that is, no break from fingertip to shoulder, may be used to good advantage to initiate nearly every slur in the first movement. The locked arm is a decided help in the short slurs, for example, at measure 7, at measure 20, measure 48, measure 96, and measure 109. Remember that such aids help not only the technical problem, but the musical meaning as well. With a great composer like Beethoven, the technique and the idea are inseparable. Dropping the full arm similarly helps to initiate the trills, after which pure finger action must take over, of course, as at measure 68. A different touch, genuine hand action at the wrist, is required to play the staccatos in this movement with the requisite crispness, as at measure 26. Make a special effort to achieve this crisp staccato in the left hand at measure 17 and similar places, on the theory that all unslurred eighth notes in classic allegros are meant to be staccato. Crispness is also essential in the right-hand staccatos of the development section. You may like to interchange your hands in doing the melisma at measure 53 and later. Or you may find that an interchange here interferes with the smooth line. The interchange works even better for the arpeggios starting at measure 72 and similarly at 201. Left, right. But it is not advisable for the shorter arpeggios in the development section unless to let the left hand take the first F at measure 124, left hand, and similarly 2 measures later. The Alberti bass, beginning in measures 46 and 170, calls for the clean finger staccato, expected in this period, and achieved best by playing on the tips of rounded fingers rather than with the flatter fingers that are now usually preferred. As always, a simple, logical, yet resourceful fingering can help you out of many difficulties. For example, try using 1-3-4-2 each time for 4 beats beginning at the end of measure 244. 1-3-4-2, 1-3-4-2, 1-3-4-2. Regarding the ornaments, I shall make what may seem like categorical pronouncements merely to save space on this crowded record, but the fact is that we are less sure how to play the ornaments in Mozart's and in Beethoven's music than in Bach's. I can only tell you what my own experience has led me to prefer, without attempting to go into the complex reasoning behind my choices. I start the trills in this first movement on the main note, except those in measures 22 and 23, 105 and 106, and 128 and 130 similarly. I do the appoggiaturas on the beat in the figure at measure 18, and whenever else that figure occurs, but I do them simultaneously in measure 85 and similar places. Other considerations in this movement will, I hope, be apparent from the other side of this record. I say I hope more from my standpoint than from yours. It is not always possible to practice what one preaches or to guarantee that one side of the record will fully agree with the other. But I do have in mind such niceties as the rounding off of all ideas, large and small, the insertion of breathing spots at the divisions in the form, and in proportion to the importance of those divisions, the sufficient but not excessive projection of the main ideas, the contrast of dynamic levels within a purposely somewhat limited dynamic framework, and a very sparing use of the pedal, which might otherwise cloud the airy texture. The delightful second movement is a tour de force in its own way, a kind of perpetual motion in staccatos. Neat hand action at the wrist and in both hands is essential throughout, as at measures 35 to 38. The tempo can be just as fast as the difficult 30-second notes can be gotten in at measure 43 and elsewhere. These can best be done as part of a single arm throw. I change from 4-2 to 3-1 each time, 4-2, 3-1, but others may prefer no change of fingers. Another limitation on the tempo is imposed by the tick-tock figure in the left hand starting at measure 50 and later at measure 155. I keep the same fingers on each of the double notes for these. And still another limitation is imposed by the 5-finger flings beginning at measure 86. I play all the trills in this movement with 5 notes starting on the main one. Again, throwing the arm helps. The offbeat accents or sforzandos add much to the scherzando character, as in the main idea itself. Or this passage near the middle, around measure 78. Yet, in spite of these and the occasional forte or double forte marks, the general level of the movement should be very soft, with great delicacy required in the handling of the ideas. Do not stretch the ritardandos beyond the point where the beat and prevailing tempo can remain very much in mind, as at measure 14, tempo, or just before the return at measure 104. And so forth. In my opinion, the third movement, the lovely minuetto, calls for the simplest and most direct sincerity. The melody needs only to be projected adequately and shaped according to its natural rise and fall in order to speak for itself, as it were. But that only must not hide the fact that it takes a lot of art to be artless. Thus, one of the problems is to give a different weight and sense to each of the 5 B-flats in the second phrase, which, typical of Beethoven, makes a crescendo to a piano mark. Be sure the C-flat in measure 9 sounds over the accompaniment and right through to the third beat. You will note that the trill was started again on the main note. The unslurred quarter notes in the trio can be detached for about half of their value, as probably was intended by Beethoven's sign, the wedge, and certainly seems appropriate to the moderate tempo of the minuet. Let the forte marks in this trio mean only a judicious forte and not a double forte, for example, at measure 24. In the coda, hear the F-flat as a strong dissonant tone resolving to a more quiet E-flat. The same strong to weak relationship still holds true at the dissection of this figure in measure 60. I take all the repeats except the second half of the trio and the second half of the minuetto when it returns. In the last movement, Beethoven obviously meant just what he said, presto con fuoco, very fast and with much verve. The tempo will be limited only by such tricky passages as the dialogue starting at measure 128, or the hand crossing that starts at measure 281. Again, although there are numerous forte marks and even whole sections, the main level ought to be light. Otherwise, the necessary fluency and sensitivity will not be possible. Even more than in the first movement, the locked arm seems indispensable to the efficient execution of many of the short slurs. The most frequent example occurs first right near the beginning. A dropping of both arms, the right immediately after the left, is needed for the requisite strength in the passage that begins at measure 50 and returns in G-flat major at measure 225. Forearm octaves provide the needed strength for the descending chordal lines beginning at measure 96. At the arpeggio figures beginning in measure 144, drop back for the coming crescendo and produce the triplet accents by supplementing the finger action from the shoulder on each beat. The dynamic markings are full of surprising contrasts. An especially striking example is the sudden forte return of the main figure after 7 soft measures. I hear the decrescendo in measure 275 as starting with a sharp peak to the preceding crescendo. Especially effective are the dramatic contrasts in the coda. After the hold sign in measure 308, I hear the same poco ritardando that Beethoven actually indicates after the next double forte held chord. Then the final a tempo, stepped up a bit as in the first movement, becomes the characteristic Sunday punch by which Beethoven ends this magnificent, sparkling, witty creation.